Hi, I'm Kriti Shah, and this is my podcast, Have You Thought About? I'm a writer who loves to find out about what passions people are pursuing, especially if they manage to blend together their skills in unusual ways. In each edition, I'm going to chat with someone whom I find particularly interesting and who's managed to fit things together in their life or profession that you might not think of as an obvious match. Here, I'm speaking to poet, copywriter, and brand strategist Rishi Dastidar. Rishi, you're an actual, genuine, proper published poet. Now, you also have a collection available to this year. You've got various collections published. Can you just share a little bit more about your journey into becoming a published poet and what it is that we can expect from you?
A poet always naturally resiles right from being called a proper poet. Is there anything ever that's proper about poetry? Yeah, the journey is a long one and an interesting one. A friend of mine, Jo Bell, who is a great poet, a great teacher, she reckons that it takes about 10 years once you've committed to becoming a poet to go from that to actually being published. That's partly because it takes time, right, to find your voice, to actually move from that impulse of I want to write poetry because I think it's the art form for me, to actually going through the stage of juvenilia. And I don't mean that disparagingly, right? But those first attempts. And then actually that stage of absorbing your influences, reading widely, finding what you like, what you don't like, and finding actually what you want to write about as well. All of that process takes time because you are effectively becoming an artist. So most poets have that sort of lengthy backstory in terms of gestation. And it took me about that time. I didn't start writing until maybe about 2006 or so. So I came to it relatively late. I came to it just as I was turning about 30 or so. Then first collection came out in 2017. So yeah, so a fair old while of just actually learning the craft, reading, being in workshops, being around poetry, joining the community. Because I think that's the other thing. Often people have that vision of any form of writer being solitary at the desk, working away, surfacing for here's the book and then disappearing again. And yeah, that's part of it, right? But poetry is a world where there's lots of community going on as well. There's writing groups, there's going and workshopping poems, there's going to gigs and hearing readings and stuff. And so you plug into that world as well. And it's a world that's full of solidarity, it's full of community, it's full of people talking geekily about writing. And ultimately, I am mostly a geek about this stuff in the best sort of sense. Like, I like finding out what words can do. I like putting words together in interesting ways and seeing what happens and seeing what images that sparks. It's a space in which you can do that, you can play. And if you're lucky, you can sometimes change people's minds, hit people in the heart, metaphorically, cause them to rethink something. So all of that sort of fun additional bonus stuff as and when it happens. Long may that continue. I've got a new pamphlet coming out in a few weeks. Hopefully book 4 coming next year as well. So yeah, so on we go.
But how did you actually find your voice? You are saying about taking part in those workshops. Like, what did you grow up
Mm.
reading and what has influenced you? Or is it a mishmash of things?
It's a mismatch of things, right? So I didn't study literature. My first degree is in history, and then I studied media regulations. I came to literature very, very late. It's not that I wasn't reading, right? But English GCSE was as far as it went in my household, and Mum threw a bit of a fit when if I suggested doing an English A level. So that didn't happen. But I was reading sort of some Dickens and some Austen and some Hardy and what have you growing up, but not poetry at all. So I came to it very specifically through just an accident. I was in the Borders bookshop on Oxford Street, so that dates how long ago it was, right? And I just popped in one lunchtime while I was working just off Oxford Street. And going up the escalator to the first floor, there was a book on the left-hand side, and it had the title Ashes for Breakfast by a poet called Durs Grunbein. Something about that just appealed, and I went over and I picked up the book, and I had a Damascene conversion. I'd never seen what this language was doing on the page, right? Just even the thrill of, oh, what? I don't have to go to the bottom of the page. I don't have to go to the end of the right hand margin. Right? Wow, okay, this is interesting. And then started to read what he was doing, and there were these brilliant classical allusions. There were allusions to living in Berlin. There's the poem that really grabbed me was a poem called Bathtubs, which is just this most hilarious 14 lines or so about how life can be lived in a bathtub. And my mind was blown. My mind was blown that, hang on, you can be serious and funny and high culture and low culture all in the space of this really short thing. And I basically at that point had found the thing that I wanted to write. And I pretty much, yeah, bought the book, devoured it, and by the Friday maybe had signed up to a course at City Lit, the further education college in Covent Garden. And that was an introduction to poetry course. And that was where I started. And yeah, it was a real process of education, training in craft, reading, reading, reading. And so through that and over the years, Daljit Nagra's poetry was a big influence on me. Frank O'Hara, the great New York school poet, big influence on me. There's Vikram Seth in there. There's Joe Shapcott in there as well. But I draw from other places. Well, David Foster Wallace, the late American novelist and essayist, is a canonical figure for me. I'm enough of a Generation X baby that Douglas Copeland's sort of wryness and flipness is somewhere in there as well. So there's a lot that's going on that is poetic influence, but drawing from hopefully the perspectives of how others are seeing the world as well. Let's go in there.
People dabble. A lot of people dabble.
Mm.
But you've decided that it is actually part of your career path. It is actually something that you feel strongly enough and are good enough, because that's also something that's actually quite important here, that it can get published. It's being picked up elsewhere. You're also being able to review it. So it's part of what you offer as a storyteller. And how have you managed to have, I guess, that grit, that dedication to actually then also be able to monetize something that for many is purely a passion?
I'm raising an eyebrow and a wry smile at monetize, so let's be relative here. So there's a couple of things in there. One is that just a sense that this is the thing that out of the things that I can do that I am better than average at doing. So why wouldn't I try and see how far I can go with this thing if I've got what I feel is some facility with it, and crucially some others agree, right? I don't, none of this happens if there isn't some sense of doors opening. Practically speaking, I've had a lot of help on the way. I've had investment in my development on the way. I was part of a scheme called the Complete Works, which ran for about 10 years between about 2007 through to 2017, which helped, Arts Council funded and helped to bring forward and develop 30 poets of Black and Asian ethnic origin in the UK to correct a historic imbalance in the number of poets of colour that had been published in the UK up until that point. So I feel a responsibility to carry on in that sense as well. If the public purse has been used to help me develop my craft, I feel that I should keep going and work in that craft as well. Unfashionable as it may be to say now, right? There is a little bit of me that still thinks it's important to be seen and try and be seen as a role model. I would not have run at this so much if I hadn't seen Daljit doing it. Looking at this world and then suddenly seeing someone who looks like me standing up and reading their work and making the language vivid and exciting was like, oh, wow, okay, maybe there is space for me in this world, right? And so the more that I can do it, the more that I can make the work, make good work, hopefully have some degree of profile. And then that means that other people look and go, oh, yeah, well, if he can do it, maybe I can have a go, right? I think that's important. That's why I try and balance both careers as well, because I feel that same responsibility on the copywriting and the brand strategy side of my life as well, because in my 20 years of doing it, I haven't come across that many writers of color in the commercial world. And so the more that I can be high profile and visible there and say, look, this is something that potentially you can do as well. So there's a read across in that sense. And the one thing I haven't said, of course, is that doing poetry fundamentally is fun for me. I wouldn't be spending time doing it if I didn't like doing it. When am I happiest? I am happiest when I am scribbling words down and making them make some sort of sense to me. and then hopefully they make some sort of sense to the wider world as well.
Fantastic. And that element of play is really important. Now, before we go on to, and I
Mm,
do want to speak more about the copywriting and the brand strategy side,
mm,
I just actually want to give you a bit of a shout out here because I got a bit more confident about my own poetry because I went to a
yeah.
Spread the Word event. Yeah, you're a former chair of Spread the Word. And it was something that was advertised over the pandemic, actually, for
Mm,
people who were feeling less confident, I think, about their work. And it was actually about nature writing. And that was something that
yeah.
I wanted to do. So the fact that you're involved with that, the fact that Spread the Word exists, it's amazing. It does make a difference. And again, just before we go on, that element of giving back, that is something that seems to be running throughout the work that you do, but it isn't purely about being somebody of global majority. It does seem to be about giving back to the arts world as somebody
Yeah.
who has something to give in terms of the words, in terms of the development, in terms of like, why is it so important for you to do
Well,
that?
I think there's a couple of things, right? Again, if I'd been born, say, maybe 20, 30 years earlier, I'd be what's called a good committee man. I am good in those sorts of spaces where those sorts of decisions can be made and taken. So again, pushing at an open door in that sense. I think people don't appreciate and recognize that a lot of literature in this country depends on the constant nurturing and watering of the grassroots. Where do the new voices emerge from? They emerge from the work done by organizations and bodies like Spread the Word, who go into communities where writing, creative writing, ideas about publishing are, not front and center. They're not top of mind, right? And it's almost outreach is possibly a bit strong, right? But it's a bit John the Baptist, right? It's like this thing that happens that might feel a million miles away. No, you could be part of this world as well. You have a story, you have a voice. Try it, see what happens, see what emerges when you put pen to paper. The world is always hungry for new voices, the world is always hungry for new stories. Then the job is to encourage, the job is to help find paths and routes in for people to, if they have talent, if they have the ability to stick at it, to run at it as much as they can. And there are very few writers working in the UK today who have not benefited in some way from some help like that, right? And it sort of makes sense for me that if I can give back in that way, I should give back. As it turns out, my particular talent happens to be being able to chair boards of organizations that do that. So that's what I did at Spread the Word for a couple of years. That's what I'm doing now at Wasafiri. But I do think it's good for me as an artist as well to do that sort of work because it keeps me plugged into some of the live issues and pressures that all arts organizations, that all artists are facing around funding, around visibility, around AI and copyright. These are all live things that affect creativity, that affect creative industries more broadly. And I think that is, I don't think I could ever be the sort of artist that just disappears into the ivory tower and chucks the book down every 5 years, for better or worse, right? That's just not how I operate.
And let's go on to this other space that you're also in, using your
Hmm.
words and the skills you have there. And in fact, I say other space, but they're two separate spaces. So there's brand strategy and there's copywriting. They're together, but they're also not together. So
Yeah.
can you explain, one, the difference for perhaps those who don't know, and two,
Yeah.
how you've navigated both paths?
Yeah, you're right to tease that difference out, right? Because there is a difference, but some overlap. I started thinking about it and doing it at a time when brand was really rising up the business agenda, to use a horrible set of cliches there, apologies. Around the time that Naomi Klein published No Logo and almost came at it through that reverse position. He identified that this thing, this intangible asset that a lot of corporations had, could add value to the balance sheet and be attractive to consumers. And oh, okay, that looks interesting. What's going on here? This symbolic value that these images and these messages can start to accrue. And brand strategy, simplifying very, very highly, is almost literally what it says. How do we develop a brand that stands for something, that cuts through, that reaches the audience that it wants to reach, and build some sort of idea and reputation in people's minds. At one level, I've presented and it sounds trivially simple. At another level, it can be fiendishly complex, right? Because you think about all the potential brands that you might engage with on a day-to-day basis. There are some now, right? We're talking via Zoom. There's a brand. I'm doing this via a MacBook Air. There's another two brands in that, and on and on and on we could go. The hardest thing to do in modern marketing is to get someone's attention. Or no, the second hardest thing is to get someone's attention. The first hardest thing is to get someone to care. A brand strategy, when done well, can hopefully contribute to both the gaining of attention and the giving of a damn, for want of a better phrase. But one must always be humble in the face of this. You are not the most important things in people's lives by any stretch of the imagination, right? So there's a lovely interplay of thinking about business strategy, but doing it, and you're sort of mandated to, licensed to do it in a creative way. You're not coming to a brand strategist for rigorous McKinsey style business reorganization, advice on strategies and mergers. What we're good at is understanding how societies are moving, how societies are changing, how trends are interplaying, and then how does your particular product, service, whatever it might be, fit within that landscape? How can it carve out space? How can it get attention if that's the particular aim? So it can be very theoretical. And of course, copywriting as a skill set then feeds into the communication aspects that can start to bring some of those ideas to life. Thinking about how do you write those messages that start to get attention, writing the ads that might start to get attention, writing the other forms of communication that might start to be part of a brand experience. And so the writing is almost a thing that cuts across everything. And sometimes I'll be working on projects where it's a very tight brief, it's a very tight audience. I say simple, it is a translation job, a writing job. There'll be other briefs where we don't know what we're looking for. Big creative brief, right? What's the idea that can help to achieve a particular goal, whatever that goal might be? And writing comes into that, but it's actually far more about what's the idea, and then where do we grab that, and how can we grab that, and how can we bring that to life? As much as one tries to put this stuff into boxes, it's hard because it's fluid and it starts to leak and go in different places as well.
What have you been proud of? Are there any particular projects that you're allowed, I guess, to give names of that you've been involved in and help people think differently?
Yeah, there's one in particular, which, because of course, the rise of this type of thinking over 20 years has meant many NGOs and charities and arts and heritage organizations have adopted some degree of brand thinking as well over the years. And I worked with a client a couple of years ago who were at that time called the International HIV/AIDS Alliance, a campaigning body that had grown out of AIDS activism in the late 80s, early 90s, and less of a public facing name, but more an umbrella sort of body that helps to coordinate anti-HIV and AIDS efforts on the ground in sub-Saharan Africa and elsewhere around the world. Does a lot of fundraising with with UN bodies, other governments to fund its work. And they came to agency that I was working at the time saying that we're coming up to being 25 years, we're sort of feeling a bit tired. We're feeling a bit, the mission is exhausted, which is a problem, of course, because AIDS, HIV as a medical problem isn't done. Because we've had such success in turning it, from a death sentence into a life sentence, people think that as a problem, it's gone, right? It's become a chronic disease. And that's largely true in in the developed world. Sub-Saharan Africa, elsewhere, it's not. It's still a significant problem. How do you put that back on the agenda? We think we're the organization that can do that, but we need to give ourselves a kick as well. So that was the sort of problem that they presented us with. And it was one of those where you get the management team who wanted to really drive change, CEO chair that wanted to drive change as well. And we had the license to really run with it. And through that, we changed the name of the organization. So they became Frontline AIDS. So we move them from this sort of like background body into someone much more on the front foot. And as part of that, yeah, wrote a narrative, wrote a whole series of ads and messages that really just dialed up the energy, dialed up the anger, and just really just right, it's here, we're still here, we have to fight, we have to keep going, we have to re-energize ourselves to go again. And it was one of those pieces that really just landed well internally, landed well externally. And it's now a case study in one of the main copywriting textbooks. So that's in part why I talk about it, right? That other people have seen it and recognized it and went, yeah, okay, that's a good piece of writing. So you can sometimes have an impact like that, although where you can shift an organization, you can help to try and shift wider debates, and yeah, your peers recognize it as well.
That's amazing. That's absolutely brilliant. But the other thing I also wanted to find out about was when it comes to copywriting, like, yeah, how do you make sure that it's fresh, but also how do you make sure there's still that difference between copywriting and content writing?
Well, that is a good question, right? Let's separate those two things out. Last one first. I'm not sure that there is a significant difference between copywriting and content writing, because I'm not sure that I accept the premise that's implicit in that, that one is flashier and attention grabbing and one is almost space filling. Now, I deliberately am exaggerating slightly, but one can take the approach that content writing is, yeah, because it's optimized for a certain task, it has to fit those boxes. And if it's a bit showier than that, then it's doing something wrong. Because something works for the Google crawler, why can't it work for a human audience as well? Right. And I think often people think, okay, got to work for SEO. And if in doing that, then it can't work for humans. And so therefore there is a difference there between the two arts. And you sort of have to come back to like, who the hell are you writing this for? If you aren't assuming that a human at some point is going to read it, then I still think you're doing it wrong. This is where AI in writing and copywriting comes in, right? Because if you start from the assumption we have to reward crawlers before anything else, then of course you're going to be happy giving the AI to write the words, because you're saying we just have to tick some boxes. We just have to make sure that it fits recognized patterns so that it means that we're first, second, third on the search result. And then sure, yeah, guess what? LLMs are great at pattern recognition and pattern regurgitation, but you don't need a human to write it. But of course, you are still assuming that a human is going to read it, right? Aren't you? And if you're not, then why are we in this business? So I challenge that fundamental premise that's implicit in your question. And I think lots of communication would be better served if we at least started to think that humans are still a key part of your audience, right? My goodness, this assumption that especially B2B communication, is only written by robots to be read by robots. No, I still think there's humans signing the check somewhere along the line. In terms of keeping things fresh, I think there's good fortune in terms of that's inherent within the business and the craft itself, because yeah, sure, you can develop a specialism, but still on any given day across any given year, I could be writing for a bank, a software company, a charity, a car manufacturer, whatever it might be. And so there's that sudden need to learn as much as you can, as quickly as you can about these different things. And so there's that sense of keeping it fresh and that new challenge. Do I know everything that I could need to know about making custard, for example? Well, no, I better go learn if I want to write the ad for birds. And I think this stretches across any form of writing. Good writers are curious, just generally. And they've either trained themselves to be or they are. And so will be more likely than not to be found truffling around things that probably on the surface don't have any relation to what the hell it is they're writing at any given moment, but yet it's somehow interesting to them. And so we'll know that going to this really recherche exhibition at the Wallace Collection probably has no bearing on how you explain collateral debt obligations for a bank, but maybe it does. Who knows, right? There is some weird synaptic link that you're probably forging. And then same for a random book that you might pick up. That cultivation of curiosity is for me that way that I certainly approach it. And my goodness, I haven't read all that I want to read. There's so much more that's out there for me to be waiting to be discovered. And yeah, let's be blunt, stolen from, inspired by as well, right? So it's cultivating that, and it can be a brutal business at times as well. You are only as good as your last campaign, your last piece of work, right? And so you ideally need to be continually just thinking about, yeah, what is fresh, what is different, what is new, right? If you keep it interesting for yourself, chances are you're going to keep it interesting for the audience too. And I think that's fundamentally the starting place.
Something else that feeds through everything you do actually is independent music. Now, as a poet, you must appreciate good lyricists, but apparently, music from the late 1990s and early 2000s, it has really shaped you. And bearing in mind that our audience is pretty global, are we talking about world music? Are we talking about a particular area of London? What are we talking about here?
We're talking a very particular form of, I'm going to be blunt, white boy guitar music from 1991 onwards.
Can I wait? I have to interrupt here, but you're not a white boy.
No,
Are you?
exactly, right? And we can probably unpack the problematic nature of all of that in a moment, right? But the thing that really set my creative and artistic axis spinning, 13 in 1991, that was a big year in the sense of a couple of albums which were released, which went on to be era defining. Primal Scream, Screamadelica was one of them. Another one was My Bloody Valentine's Loveless. That was the one that changed my life. I had only just started reading New Musical Express at maybe a few weeks before, slowly sort of like discovering that world. And then it was a Monday night in October. Mark Radcliffe had a show on Radio 1 called Out on Blue 6. And the trail fades out, and this unearthly sound emerges from the speakers. And it was, what the hell is this? Was it an elephant blaring? Was it a whale doing something? It was just a sound I'd never heard before. And then there was a clatter of sort of like drums and guitars that sounded more recognizable. Okay, that sounds like something rock and roll. And then this elephant sound comes back again, and then it goes again, then it comes back again. That 2.5 minutes just set my head spinning, right? Yeah, and Mark goes, that was Only Shallow by My Bloody Valentine. Right, I better go find out what the hell that is. So I think, the Saturday I went to Our Price, a record chain, bought that album. And and fundamentally, most of my life since then has been chasing that same shock of the encounter that I had that Monday night and trying to find that through whatever form of art form that I come across. Yeah, that first 10 years, it's mostly coming through music, and it's mostly coming through those bands like Suede, like Blur, like Oasis, that just providing that sense of commonality, community, impressionable age, right? I'm a teenager, so of course I'm going to fall for this sort of stuff. But then it comes through literature, it comes through the poetry, and then later, as I start to learn and understand more about visual art as more physical arts, I had a similar reaction. The first contemporary dance piece I saw at the Place, the dance studio in North London. A similar sort of, wow, this is amazing. I don't understand what's going on, but it's amazing. Same reaction the first opera I saw at Covent Garden, Manon Lescaut. Again, same sort of, I'm being thrilled by something that I don't fully understand. I'm very much a neo, someone who chases the new in that sense. But specifically through entering sort of like British indie music at that point, I learned a lot of aesthetic cues, and it was still close enough to punk that a lot of the attitude of spirit and of 77, 78, 79 are still floating around. And that sense of building parallel networks, that sense of, okay, if someone's not giving us a chance, we're going to make our own chances, that sense of, okay, the wider world won't have us, let's build our own world. Of course, the manifestos that start to articulate what this is all about. The work and the aesthetic approach that Factory Records took in particular, right? New Order are a brilliant band for so many reasons, but one of them is the uncompromising rigor and aesthetics with which they engaged with the world. Peter Saville was often briefed to make sleeves which didn't have their name on them, didn't have their faces on them. And then you've got this lovely challenge of, okay, how the hell do you get the album out known in the world when you've not got any identifying markers on it. I love that sense of playfulness. That's helped shape my approach to, okay, how do you put work out there? What's most important? Well, it's always the quality of the work. It's always the quality of what you're trying to do, what you're trying to say. And then you work out ways of getting it to people. You try not to get those confused. I've not just got great aesthetic and great art and great rock and roll from it, but I've got some sort of fundamental blueprint for how I try and go about doing things as well.
And that was the amazing Rishi Dastidar. Do you have an interdisciplinary life? Because I would love to hear from you, and perhaps we can chat on this podcast that goes with my newsletter, which is called Have You Thought About? It can be found via www.ruthishah.com. Please join me next time for a fun conversation with another guest who likes to mix up lots of things in their life. Do listen to past episodes and rate and review the podcast if you've enjoyed it. Thank you to Rian Shah for the music.